on the train, I live outside Berlin in the country, past those brown fields already in May and June. And to me, somebody who grew up on a farm, that's like, you know, the world has stopped turning. It's something that's just, it shouldn't be possible that the grass is already brown before the summer has properly started. And then you arrive there and everybody's like, oh, nice weather. And anyway, now we need to figure out who's right about the normative foundations of Frankfurt School, whether it's Habermas or Holland. And I just couldn't do it anymore at some point. And I also felt that, of course you can do amazing work of eco-philosophy within that framework and within that institution, but I felt some of the knowledge that I had from childhood experiences, from sort of more narrative contexts, from sort of non-scientific expert knowledge seemed somehow a bit more important than reading kind of another 3 meters. So I was looking for a genre that allowed me to combine that. And then I just wrote it down, and it seems some people found it readable. So that's how it happened.
I think Tereza wanted to step in the debate.
Before you start diving in your book, thanks for sharing this reflection of your journey out of academia. And maybe at the beginning, I could in a few sentences clarify why I stayed in academia while having rather similar, you know, experiences and feeling about some urgencies, and actually I still find it so important to try to do academia differently, because it finally is so influential side of power knowledge in current societies, that even if I totally understand you and why you decided to leave, and it's completely legitimate option in my view, I also think it's important that we try to stay within the academia and try to do it differently. And my 2 ways of doing academia differently, one is in geopolitical terms. So I have recently really, because I am as concerned as you are about the ecological and climate impact of being academic, with all these, you know, flying to conferences. It's madness. It's unsustainable, ecologically, maybe even socially for many people, and so on. And what, at least for me, partly is an answer, is really to build what I call regional internationality. So instead of, well, I have never been to the US, but of course I have flown to various places for conferences, and I still do once in a while, but I really try to develop regional connections to, you know, to groups in Berlin, in Vienna, in Munich, in Warsaw, this regionality, I actually define it by what I can comfortably reach by train. So when we have a more robust fast train system in Europe, my region will lengthen or you know, would grow. But I really and this sort of made me to discover interesting people nearby in the, you know, vicinity of Germany, Poland, or Austria, that I did not have on my epistemic map before. So that's one thing. And the other, for me, extremely important is interdisciplinarity, and especially really across social sciences and natural sciences, and in my case now medical sciences. So I've been trying to develop quite an intense collaboration with people, you know, doing biomedical research, and instead of, you know, taking this stance of, okay, I do critical social studies of current biomedicine and their reductive way of doing things. I rather try to do something with them, and you find very open people there, very smart people there, and very non-reductive people there, you know, with whom I can, you used this funny notion of that the current academia did not even allow for you to think straight anymore. I would say with whom I cannot think straight, because I think it's good actually sometimes not to think so straight, but to think a bit clear. And this difficult interdisciplinarity across very different languages and methods, I think it allows that, and I like the way it disturbs my straightness.
That's great. Yes, I think we have to differentiate two senses of straight. I'm all for thinking non-straight in the queer sense. I was more talking about the non-straight of a bend back.
Yeah, thank you. That was. I think this is, of course, this would be for a debate on its, like, for an own special debate. About staying or leaving academia, and it's actually interesting that many, I think nearly everybody who is doing some interesting work inside of academia is once upon a time thinking about leaving academia. So it's somehow this tension is there, and maybe yeah. So but let's if you could say some more information about the actual topic of this book, maybe also in the contrast of what is being done in the German academia in philosophy, but you don't have to. Just let's go to your to actually what you wanted to say with this book and what were your inspirations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are two ways to summarize, and I can never decide which to use.
You can use the longer one because you have a lot of time.
I'm not sure everybody is as patient as you, Matěj. So let me start from the title. It's called Revolution for Life, and one of the core claims of the book is that there is something of the sort of a shared grammar or family resemblance between a multiplicity of contemporary forms of protest and social movements. Movements such as Black Lives Matter or Latin American feminism, the radical ecological movement, some indigenous struggles, I think even some strands now of the Palestinian solidarity movement. That's a separate debate again. That could be summarized as having the notion of life very much at their center and sort of mobilizing against something like socially enforced death or even extinctions or species extinction in ecology or femicides. Also the Iranian revolution, like the feminist movement, was against the state femicide of Zina Amini. So that was just an observation, and I mean, as an observation, it's quite banal, but it's interesting that this rhetorics of life is pervasive in the movements. And then I thought about it a bit longer, and I was so tired by so many people on the traditional left denouncing all those mobilizations as kind of identity politics, not interested in material questions, not anti-capitalist. And it somehow didn't seem to map also what I was seeing amongst the discussions and activists in those quarters. And also I was stunned when reading some of the activist literature how rich this notion of life was. And then I eventually, somehow, it clicked that this fit together with something I had been thinking about in a more analytic register, because that's what we do as critical theorists. We kind of try to analyze what the basic structures of society and of capitalism are, where it seemed to me that to understand the operation of capitalism at present, you can't just repeat the diagnosis that it exploits labor. It does that, but while it does that, it also destroys life. And there are ways of capitalist value generation at present that don't even presume very much the exploitation of labor anymore. But if we continue this form of ecology, it will, with necessity, escalate the ecologically destructive effects we see at the moment. But that's not an effect of capitalism only as a system of profit-seeking or commodity exchange. It's something that I think is a bit deeper ingrained into modernity, and something that also the real existing state socialism didn't overcome, and that's a certain, as it were, relation to the world, other social beings, social relationality, that we in the Frankfurt School usually call reifying, but I think that's not enough. Like, why making something into a thing could also be nice if you treat the thing properly. It's making something into a thing on the template of modern property. And modern property alone has this, in history, in all of human history, has this crazy feature that whatever falls under it is exposed to destruction by the legitimate owner. So you pose something as controllable and even abusable and destructible by turning it into property, or at least into kind of potential property. And this property logic is, I think, something that structures several domains of domination in modernity. So there are many of the forms of domination existed before. They especially patriarchy, for instance, predates modern capitalist societies, but it got re-articulated on the basis of the property form, so that the oppression of women by men was modeled on a certain sort of property relation over aspects of women's life, over the reproductive capacity, not the whole person, obviously not, unless it was actually an enslaved woman, but patriarchy is the dominion over reproductive labor, for instance, and our whole extractivist economy is modeled on the propertization of nature, or the dominion over nature. And I think those movements for life that I sketched at the beginning can be seen as a revolt against dominion in different domains. The dominion over racialized bodies, dominion over, indeed, reproductive labor, dominion over ecological resources, sort of areas where we've come to almost take for granted that destruction is sort of ongoing or inevitable, or only stopped in kind of, oh, there's an exception. You're allowed to own a dog, but you're not allowed to beat it or something. So that's the, and now you have the two parts. The one part is a kind of a certain type of a more property-based analysis of capitalism, and the other one is a sort of also quite speculative attempt at drawing links between existing social movements and kind of arguing that they are resisting capitalism more than you would have thought if you understand it in a particular way, with centering on dominion and not just on profit.
Thank you. Tereza, I think wanted to pose a question or maybe comment.
It was only a short provocative question regarding when you define these different movements in terms of pro-life. So apparently there is one pro-life initiative which takes it to its name. So I wonder if and how you can deal with that. Yes. Because somehow it has to be taken seriously or analyzed symmetrically.
Yes, I think we are at a moment where
how they relate to
both progressive and regressive movements are mobilizing around life. And there's very obviously a neo-fascist politics of life, and there's a progressive politics of life. And I actually think it's not so hard to tell them apart, because if you have this analysis of the genealogy, history, saturated analysis of propertization, then the progressive politics for life that I describe in the book, they all want to liberate or emancipate a certain domain from past violence or from the propertization that is imposed on it. Whereas what the reactionary or the right-wing movements do is they want to defend and uphold a certain domain as propertized, often in a kind of more abstract and phantasmatic registers. So if it's not the husband anymore who directly in a marriage undercover to her controls the reproduction of the woman, then at least there should be some laws and the government and kind of also medical control regimes that make it so that the woman continues to be dispossessed of her own reproductive freedom. So that, for instance, pregnancy remains propertized and remains in that kind of state of being under dominion. Whereas I think this is very important, because I think a struggle for reproductive freedom that just fights for the liberal value of my belly is mine, I think that's not a fully radical struggle. I think that's kind of a compromise with the world we live in, where you can only protect something if you call it property. But it shows that and I mean, it doesn't work, because the current neo-fascists are kind of too clever. The Meloni says, yes, it's your belly, you can do what you want, but we've closed, like, all the abortion clinics they're so far away and so expensive that with your belly that you own, you can't go there. And as soon as the right wing says, yes, you own your body, but the fetus is a person and owns itself, it also doesn't help you anymore, because you own your front garden, but if a child runs over your front garden, you're not allowed to shoot it. So you have to actually conquer the full freedom of the woman to dispose over her life and her time and her care and kind of just live her life freely and depropertize this very process of reproduction. So to me, in some sense, of course, I'm sure they will get messy and not always work, but I would say the marches for life of the anti-abortion people, they precisely want to continue and defend the patriarchal phantom possession in female reproduction, whereas the pro-life feminists, as it were, like in Latin America, who always invoke that figure of life, they are fighting for the full reproductive potentia as a free, sort of depropertized capacity.
I can just quickly comment on, of course, thanks for this, articulating this out. That's helpful and interesting to dive deeper into, assumption of your analysis. And I take your point, but I also think that, and I think it's important to make distinctions along the lines you do. But I also think that taking seriously this issue of pro-life, you call it fascist, whatever, pro-life movement, I think it also, when we want to face it, it also might push us in a productive way to reconsider how we analyze the other progressive side in terms of, you know, questions such as, can you ever be pro-life in an indiscriminatory way? Doesn't always some life sort of imply some non-life or death, things like that. And also, very interestingly, I think we have to, because if we put life in these words in the center of our thinking and appreciate it as an important value, it might actually sort of suggest that death, as the double of life, is something negative, undesirable, and I think this would be pity, and we should really also take this into account in relation maybe to overpopulation of various species on this planet, you know, issues like that. So, you know, where is the appreciation of death? You know?
That's amazing. I have to answer.
Very good question. I think also I actually wanted to discuss that later, but I think now is a good time because I think there is more about it in Eva's last book actually. So it's more, if you want to read more about, then read the Bleibefreiheit, but Eva, please.
I think it's a really good point to push me, but I will start by pushing back. So, human death is undesirable. And I think a truly secular philosophy really shouldn't reconcile with death too easily. And I don't, so that's now not presuming that's your position, but I had many discussions with kind of Haraway-inspired people who then get really gooey eyes and tell me all about how composting is so great and they will live on and blah, blah, blah. And I really think it's important to understand that, I mean, as humans have a particular way of living their time and their life, and we're aware of our singularity. We have certain attachments to singular others, I mean, as do many other animals, but losing someone, you won't be consoled by it knowing that, oh, now the earth feeds the worms. I mean, there is something really like drastic about death, and a lot of our political passion comes from avoiding unnecessary, structural, premature death. So, for instance, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the great abolitionist thinker, has this definition of racism where she says racism is the higher propensity of one group to die statistically earlier. And that's actually super true of class as well. Especially, actually, men in the working classes die a decade earlier than women. Like, that's a scandal. We have to not reconcile with that. I think there is a certain point at which probably, as I grow older and wiser, maybe I will learn a bit more, we also do need to reconcile ourselves. I would never say, I think we need to reconcile ourselves with finitude. I think death, like we don't even know it. I do think our task is to sort of care for life as long as it's there. And then it comes to the other part of your question, which I think that they are totally agree. Of course, you can't have a indiscriminate celebration of everything existing, because that would be kind of a very undifferentiated vitalism. And I think a lot of the work where I try to distinguish all those dependencies of sort of metabolisms through time that sustain some life are an attempt to have, in some sense, a very fragile and plural notion of life. So not a kind of Nietzschean vitalist one. where it's 1/4 or something. It's always a sort of ensemble of things. And the way I solved it now, and that might not be sufficient, is that I have this way of speaking that I say there are kind of 4 crucial gestures of a revolution for life. And the first is rescuing precarious lives. So, I mean, it starts exactly with Black Lives Matter and not with All Lives Matter. So there is an idea that we can, from sharing narratives, but also, I think, from sort of sociological analysis, we can say which lives are unjustly disadvantaged, and I would say those are often the ones that have been propertized in the past and are still under the afterlife, for instance, as Saidiya Hartman would say about Black American populations, afterlife of slavery, afterlife of property, and those lives need to be freed or liberated first, and then I think that gives you this kind of precarity of certain lives, maybe gives you a radar how it doesn't become like a triumphalist philosophy of life, but more like a caring and discerning one. And I think I also also when I talk about ecology, I'm maybe sometimes not good enough at bringing out a certain type of brutality and the constant choices you make when sustaining anything, partly because it's so natural to me, you know. I mean, tonight I dreamt of carrying away the slugs from my paprika bed because I wasn't at home where I carried the slugs away yesterday. But, you know, we can make choices. I just carry them away. I don't cut them in half as my grandmother used to do. So there are, and still, they probably can't eat as well on the other side of the road. And so there is some aggression.
Thank you. Maybe if you don't want to react immediately, or you do.
No, okay. You probably do, but
maybe I would like to get back to this, to your critique, to the argument about property, which is sort of in the center of your critique, not only of the system of capitalism as a system, but also like structures of how we deal with this world and with relationships and so on. So this is what is exactly like you talked about. The question would be maybe a banal question, where actually the problem with property is starting. If you like, if the problem starts when we sort of when property is not limited to certain material part of our world, and when we sort of introduce the relationship to property, the dominion over property or Sachherrschaft into especially human relationships, but also to other relationships, to life, to our sort of natural environment and so on. Or if your argument even goes like deeper into the very institution of property, which from many other perspectives can be somehow seen as as somehow important in the struggle for liberal freedom and so on. So if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe one way to explain it is to say that, so one theory of modern property is always to say it's a bundle of rights. It sort of binds together certain legal entitlements. And then there are several ways of how you reconstruct it. I go for a fairly simple one now. Then the first right would be the right to exclude others. If it's mine, I can kind of tell you not to get it, and there's a whole state apparatus enforcing that power of mine. And a lot of left critique is very focused on that right, either because they have a kind of commons perspective and think we should not have this kind of right to exclude to that extent, or because it's a socialist idea where you say that at least with certain types of property in the means of production, it shouldn't be a private entity having exclusive control and the right to get rid of others, but it should be the state who holds those goods. And that's, I mean, so that is super important. In some sense, I just have philosophically nothing to add. But I do think if we want to also understand the immense, entirely irrational resistance, even of many not very property people, against the redistribution of property. Like how many people think that if some big real estate companies are disowned, their own freedom is at stake. And I mean, also, I know that obviously there is a kind of Eastern European experience that makes that like very true, but still it seems that it's kind of run amok in a way that I think one needs to understand. Like, why do we think our whole freedom and self is so tied up with the protection of property as it is? And I think for that we need to look at the two other sticks in this bundle of rights. And the second one is the right to abuse, so that if something is your property, you can't just exclude others, but also you can do whatever you want with it. And that's a kind of freedom that's insane. That wasn't invented in world history before. It's very new, and I think it always has a certain problem with it. Not only when the property is actually a living being, or perhaps even a human. I mean, in that case, it's completely insane. But this fantasy that you can do whatever you want burdens the individual with a sovereignty that we anyway can never quite exert, because in the end there are always constraints. The material always resists. You don't even control yourself in a way that you can control something else fully according to your will. So it already inbuilds a certain instability. And I do think that when this relation plays out or is realized in the world between an owner who's trying to act sovereign and whichever object, pretty much, it often has destructive consequences. There are a few things I can think of, like a ripe apple, even that glass, like fine, you know, somebody can have the exclusive right to abuse it, and they do that, and then there will be another apple, and that's that. But it's even, like also with most ecological goods, if you try to delineate them and dispose over them as if they were completely inert and passive, you will with time. It's almost self-fulfilling. You treat it as dead until it is dead, and you make yourself blind to all the entanglements of every object in ecologies, in relationalities that actually sustain something. And then you can lose the capacity to reproduce that, which again then kind of feeds into the accumulative, appropriative drive. And yet then, last aspect, we also have the right to discard something. If it's yours, you can throw it away. And that seems so obvious in a way, but it's very weird. So if you live in a shared household, and if imagine I live with Matěj and then I come home and there's a kind of totally torn, dirty, rotten t-shirt of Matěj's on the sofa, then I'm like, Matěj, can you like tidy that away? Matěj can't turn around to me and be like, oh no, it's a gift for you, I've given it to you, now it's yours, you have to tidy it. Like, are you joking me? But this right to alienate even the debris and the discard is something, like that's how we run our economy. Like fossil capitalism meant that the CO2 could be discarded like an old dirty t-shirt into the ecosphere. Obviously, for a while one didn't even know one was doing it. Since the mid-70s, BP, for instance, knew exactly what they were doing and continued doing it. So there is no commodity production without also the alienation, the kind of discarding of something that is treated as non-value or non-existent from the point of economy. And that stuff kind of comes back to haunt us, you know, that way, from the point of view of the ecosystems, it's not nothing. It's there. It needs to be recycled. Like it's circulating. It keeps circulating, and we push the destructive effects into the future. So those two aspects, then I think they are problematic from the get-go. That's why I'm motivated to criticize also the form of property and not just its distribution.
Thank you for these. Yeah, that's very important. I think these aspects. Tereza, I wanted to comment or ask. I thought you at one moment. I thought you were like.
Or move on.
No. I like the way you think about, you know, some of those effects for which I normally use other concepts, but I actually want. I play the devil's advocate today, of course, to have some debate. But I was just a bit, you know, hesitating to agree with your claim that we knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were doing. They are messing something up, probably. They knew. Yeah. They knew about, you know, the CO2 impact on the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. But I think that it's important for us, and because our struggles to acknowledge, we still know not that much about the climatic system, right? So if you just consider that climate scientists are even very surprised what's happening this year after all these efforts in modeling and you know, whatever data gathering, which definitely were not there in place in 1970s. So it's just, for me, it's sort of a comment regarding also the political effects of the terms we use, because it might seem more effective to say, you know, we know and they knew and exactly, but I think it's important to acknowledge the uncertainties even on our side. And because with this acknowledgement also comes the awareness that it, for example, can be much worse than we thought even 2 years ago. And I think that that one of the problems, at least in this part of the world, by ecological concerns don't have sufficient, you know, value in public and policy debates, is that very often our side tries to claim we know this and that, and then it does not happen in those, you know, terms exactly, or not according to those predictions, and then the whole thing becomes delegitimized, right? You know, just giving an example from very different field. For example, when scientists came up with the COVID vaccine, there were so many people in the medical establishment, but even, for example, the our Ministry of Health, who that time used to be a professor of medicine, who claimed the vaccine will do this and that, and you will not contaminate, it will stop the infection and it will liberate us from. And then it did not happen. And this is, this has been partly also why the anti-vax movement got so strong and because false predictions with perhaps good intentions were made, but could not hold the trials of always complex and uncertain reality. And I think it's good and fair not to assume that those we want to fight in legitimate and important public conflicts and controversies know or knew perfectly about the harms of their action.
Yeah, thank you, that's super interesting. So, maybe two things. So first, anyway, I think it wasn't BP, it was Exxon. And so that was my first mistake. And then when I say they knew perfectly well, what I mean would be they knew as well as anyone could at that point. So there was this, I think it came out 2 years ago, right? That Exxon had studies in '75 that were predicting the kind of way that the climate warming would take place, that were sort of more or as accurate as even the very recent climate science. So it was as accurate as it gets. And they then started a huge disinformation campaign. So I do think, I want to hold them accountable to that. I do think it's a kind of shocking, like there was some knowledge and they really decided not to be like, whoa, this is uncertain, we don't know what happens, maybe we're careful, but they're like, okay, let's shut it down in a cynical campaign of lying. But I am totally on your side that a certain version of a sort of listen to the science mantra is a really bad way for any politics, definitely also for climate politics, to go. I mean, in some senses I thought that was a good key formula that I wouldn't have needed to write the book. Like that's the idea that we do need a different, more also aesthetic and ethical and political framework. But so in the tradition, I was somewhat half successfully educated. That in the Frankfurt School, we have this long discussion of criticizing positivist science, but not therefore like discrediting science. So, and I think that fits a bit with how you were talking about it, right? It's not the idea that scientific knowledge has the structure of a totally foolproof prediction, and then if something is different, it means that we knew nothing. That's just that's a misunderstanding of what science is. No working scientist would describe their practice as that. It's always this is a sort of a model with some predictions, and then you revise the model. And in a public that is not educated about that, then it is even 3 times as dangerous to sort of fake certainty where there is none. And I don't have an answer to that whole problem. I think but I would say that there is also a weird dialectical connection between the actual and real uncertainty that you were highlighting now, that we face with regard to the future, which comes as a huge shock to people sort of raised in certain types of Enlightenment beliefs, where we did think uncertainty would reduce, and now it's kind of mushrooming. And certain types of very dogmatic, held beliefs. It's almost like you cling to something, or you feel the uncertainty is so unbearable that you need to shut it down by projecting your own doubts onto someone else whom you then persecute and shout down. So those aspects, I think there's a lot to work through, and yeah, maybe that's for another panel where also I wouldn't be the expert, but that's how far my thinking goes there.
Thank you. I now have like 1 or 2 more questions, and then I would like to open the debate for everybody. So just before we do that, I wanted to skip to the other part of your book and to let's say your idea about what connects actually the movements, the progressive movements for life, and also maybe to this division, because that's what I wanted to get once more back to that, because somehow I struggle with this idea of dividing these movements in like 2 groups so easily. Also because I think a lot of these movements, or maybe protagonists of some of these movements, that I still see that there are many like contradictions, and you of course try to sort of look at what they have in common and what makes sense from your perspective. But at the same time, I think we still, I mean, what I mean is, for example, the walking the line somehow of between emancipation and politics of identity, and or even individualism, let's say, struggling for my own right. Yeah. So if you maybe could talk a bit also about that, what connects these movements, what actually maybe are the risks of some of their ideologies, or maybe also looking on the development of some of them since you wrote the book.
Yeah, so I think maybe there are 2 risks that I have in front of my eye, but I'm sure there are many more. I do think that, so it's funny because I have usually hated Nancy Fraser's diagnosis of progressive neoliberalism, and I always thought it was kind of too flat and too reductionist, and it was so ungenerous, like unforgiving and ungiving towards the feminist movement. But so her idea is that the movements that I call Revolution for Life, that they have just made the huge mistake of siding with capitalism and neoliberalism and using a neoliberal template of individualism and emancipation for their claims, so especially gay rights movements, but also feminist movements. And I also think it's there is a wild overestimation. It's almost like a bizarre voluntarism for somebody who's a Marxist to think, oh, they decided to do it this way, that was stupid, they should have done it another way. No, they were very like Marxist and hard-working feminists on the ground, but we live in an unbroken capitalism, so what gets articulated or taken up is often a kind of mock version, and you don't control that as a movement. It's not just a strategic mistake, it's a tragic, historical, real lack of power. So, and yet, I would also quarrel with something that I would then call, with the vanity of a small difference, progressive phantom possession. So, in some sense, a kind of re-propertization of certain domains, not the domains of past dominion. So, not like, you know, we had the abortion debate, not continuing the subjugation of female reproductive freedom, but only being able to even sort of reassure yourself over your accomplished liberation by constantly positing that now you own yourself, or you own your belly, or you own your sexuality, or you own your gender or pronoun. And in some sense, having to make a brand or a new, almost like a, you know, you get a patent right to your new identity, and you almost dependent on somebody trespassing, so that then you can be like, oh, now you violated it like this really bad time in the past when it was really violated, but now I can speak against it, and I have an anti-discrimination law or whatever, and so I can redraw the boundary, and that's just my identity, and there's the other. And so I don't like, that's already a caricature. I hate caricature. I mean, we haven't even won, you know, we can be critical, self-critical once we've done that, but still, I think that is a kind of liberal dead end of social movements that lead to fragmentation, because very often then somebody's sort of claim to their domain of liberation in a problematic way intersects with that of somebody else. How, on the other hand, I think intersectional movements make a real tremendous effort to not do that, and always again to undo that. So if some white feminist movement thinks they are free because every man on the street who tries to, like, harasses them goes to jail, then they will learn from Black liberation movement that, as it happens, it's mostly the black and brown men that go to jail, and it's a horrible society that has jails, and you can't just have that curse with feminism, you need to have another one. But that would be, yeah, that would be a way of propertized emancipation that I would also criticize. And I think that my inspiration to believe in something like depropertized, sort of non-sovereign individual emancipation movements is something that I draw from within those struggles. It's not just like they are all into this kind of trademarking of progressive identities, and I, Marxist ecofeminist, tell them to do something else. No, I think you learn that in discussions, in democratic procedures within progressive spaces. So I think I would look. I'm still positive about it, but that is one problem: progressive anti-possession. And another problem, of course, is, and it goes a bit along that. Not on the sort of identity plane, but on the plane of what is your chosen site of struggle, you become single issue focused. And I mean, I don't know, maybe this is anyway not so pertinent here. Well, I mean, this is the same world, right? But I'm very confused at the moment that on the one hand, I think it is important to have a certain type of pro-Gaza mobilization, and at the other hand, I'm also a bit horrified at kind of all those movements that I discussed in the book. Now, they've kind of latched onto that cause, and you know, all the other destruction is also going on. And how are we going to stop that, you know, and maybe, I mean, we have to see, maybe it comes again out of, maybe that is just the avant-garde, but maybe also not. So the kind of concentration of whatever is the most burning life that needs to be saved, without a perspective of, okay, how do we rebuild, how do we restore life, how do we connect all those struggles so that we can sort of counter this whole system of destruction and not just always be the firefighters on one side of destruction. I think I've become less optimistic than I was when I wrote the book, that it isn't also sort of a way for the system to always continue, that, you know, you contain the struggle for life in one arena and you can continue destroying life in lots of other ways.
Thank you. Tereza, you want to?
I have two more provocative questions, but I will save them after. You know, I think it's important
to
be
curious.
No, but it's not really connected so closely to what you were speaking now. So
let's maybe open the floor, and then, but we don't want to forget your provocative questions. So please, you're welcome to ask or protest or whatever. And if not, then we will continue with Tereza's questions.
The bar is quite high now.
Yes, please.
Okay, I have maybe a question, just which would be helpful for clarification for me. But maybe I missed something, so sorry if it is kind of stupid. But you started with the distinction with the alt left or alt social movements. And then how you framed it seemed to me falling still in this distinction of the alt social movements or alt left with the new social movements and new left. But my expectation was rather that you will talk about the contemporary wave, let's say.
Yeah.
So then it would be helpful to make distinction with the new social movement or the new West, this new generation struggle 60 years after.
Yeah, thank you. True, I even remember dropping it when I tried to reply to that question. So I would claim that we are witnessing a new type or a new template of struggle at the moment. And I would say it's different from a sort of Leninist, socialist redistribution and conquering and destroying state power, conquering production, the sphere of production power model of the beginning and also, of course, the middle of the 20th century. And it's also distinct from the new left that, in a way, is a kind of branching out in civil rights struggles in different sites. There, of course, anyway, I stick with that description, and then one can again undo every category as one always can, of course. But I do think that the struggles we see now really have a different logic than the one from the civil rights era or from the second wave of feminism. And I think that they respond, all of them, also the reactionary ones, and that I think that's also why it is more messy, to a world historical situation that we've never been in before, where really also life on the planet as such appears threatened. That's sort of, I'm actually not somebody who likes to emphasize apocalypse and all that. I mean, I also don't even think we will go extinct or anything, but still, that this is even a question, you know, that you even need to differentiate yourself from that, is a new dimension. And so I think this kind of bare survival vibe, and the question not only of reproduction, but even of what I call regeneration, so the labor that nature does to restore itself, that becomes pertinent in the struggle, that's a new moment. And often, even if you don't acknowledge it, you're sort of informed by it. So I think certain struggles on the right are very informed by a feeling of the world ending. If you think there is no future, it's very rational to try to grab what you can at the moment and burn the last bit of fossil fuel, because there anyway is no tomorrow. So I think that's that would be my answer to that. Thank you.
Any more?
Yes, please.
Perhaps I will continue the question about the new logic of protest movements compared with the old left and new left. I think that the post-human perspective in the protest movements is getting more ground now, more ground. There is no need to appreciate that, but we can agree that the humans are dangerous creations and are causing that. And so thinking about the world without people is now more attractive. What would you consider about this perspective in the post-humanistic perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Some of my favorite people in the world think that a world without people is attractive. I find it, well, it's not the point, yes, I find it unattractive, but I think that line of thought is, for me, too ahistorical and just calls humans dangerous, when I think a certain, I mean, now very deep-seated and long-running ways of humans organizing their reproduction is dangerous. So I also don't say, like some good lefties then always say, like, oh, but it's 10 companies that have done whatever, I always forget the number, 37% of the emissions. No, it is our capitalist form of life. There is a collective dimension of the destructiveness, but even though the benefits from it are ridiculously disparatively reaped, but it's a certain configuration of the human. And the humans, so I'm not I'm in some senses not a post-humanist. I do think humans, the animals we are, we have a specific capacity that a lot of other species don't have. Marx says it very beautifully at one point where he says, and that's again overstating the amount we know, but he says humans can live their life not just as the species that they are, but also as all other species. And then of course one has to laugh at him because like 80% of species we haven't even discovered yet, so we don't know anything. But we do know, we do know what it would take for bees not to go extinct so rapidly. There are some things we could do and change about, like we could just ban certain types of insecticides. Like we know what it would take to repair some of the damage we have done. And to me this fantasy of just thinking the humans away, it's a bit like, sorry, I'm exaggerating now, it's not against you, but it's a bit like, oh, I've made a mess of my room and now I go away and Mother Nature can tidy. No, we also have the capacity to repair some of that. And of course we also have an interest of continuing to live there. But I think humans are dangerous, but they can also be very helpful. And that would be the revolution for life, realizing that potential of those powers. And I mean, a lot of things will remain dead, right? I mean, we're not going to repair everything, and it's totally clear.
Sorry. What is it?
Maybe this is a good time for my first from the last two provocative questions, and it's actually regarding the non-human forms of life. Whatever it is, animal, microbial, or floral. I wonder to what extent you sort of idealize those non-human forms of life. It seems to me a little bit that when you talk about destruction, you really situate it within the realm of social relations, in terms of human relations and specific, political, economic formations, but I think that. And of course it's, I pose it provocatively, because I think it's important as a feature of some kind of social critique of current capitalism in more general, that nature is sort of idealized as a realm where destruction, competition, death, instrumentalization does not happen, which I mean is not really the case. For example, and having said that, I appreciate, and it's important, that there is a lot of research into how, different non-human living forms cooperate, are interlinked, things like mycorrhiza, various very interesting and sort of altruistic forms of relating between non-human forms of life. But also, I think we have to take seriously and not dismiss as only, you know, a capitalist assumption into bias in whatever natural science research, that there are forms of instrumentalization preying on, you know, within the realm of the non-human life. So it just seemed to me that it's the assumption that there are some natural ways of relating, and then there is, you know, this human that went astray, or, you know, can do better, but still there is this fantasy of this, you know, model somewhere out there that is not.
Yeah, I get you.
Out of the problems we are trying to solve. So, you know,
So,
how do you deal with it?
So I think you're completely right. As in Eva, this person here idealizes nature no end. I love flowers and birds, but the terminology in that book, I think, has resources to say precisely what it is that a capitalist reproductive system does that the rest of nature does not. And that, I think, is dominion and the discard of toxic debris. So I have no problem with death in nature. I don't even, like, maybe I should, I also think it's a bit kitsch to say it's so brutal, the wolf eats the rabbit, right? I mean, that's happening. And by saying that, I'm not even sure I would call it violence, and I'm also not worried about, actually quite shockingly, this will now cost me probably some credibility as an ecologist, I'm not even worried about humans doing that type of violence. On and off, I'm tempted to make my hunting license. I haven't done it, but mass, meat production and industrial mass farming is a kind of level of brutality or death dealing that I think it's sort of fair to call unnatural without at all not naturalizing nature as sweet and harmonious and non-bloody. You know, it's not the blood; it's a large-scale destructiveness and the discarding not of leftovers but of toxic waste. And that, I mean, maybe you also know some examples that prove me wrong, but by and large, the way that ecosystems have evolved, they evolve so that they have this circular economy where whatever some species discards, somebody else has evolved to eat or use. Whereas we've produced some stuff that just is really, like, nobody can use it very much. Like, there's nuclear waste and there's far too much CO2, and it just is a mess for our future and also for the future of, well, many species, if it's true that we are living in a 6 mass extinction event. So I think those things I would want to hold on to finding quite exceptionally messed up human, man-made dynamics.
But it's interesting for me, you now phrase it more in terms of the scale or extent rather than some, you know, fundamental ontological difference.
No, I think it is an ontological difference. Even on a small scale, toxic waste or destructive dominion would be a logic that you don't have in hunting and in compost.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me think about some counter examples.
Yes.
So one would concern the effects of our actions. So, for example, interestingly, there are now new microbial strands which has developed in the deep sea that live on the plastic debris that deposited there. I mean, of course, I'm not.
You're idealizing nature.
I'm not defending. You know, this is a green light for us to throw out plastic. Of course not. But sort of, even those really nasty actions open up new spaces for new forms of life, right? So that this one, yeah.
That's really, I think you have a point there, and partly that's why in my new work I'm so interested in time, and then I would make more of an argument, but yes, but the time it takes for evolution to catch up with our ways is still sort of too long to save us. But you might then also come back to your previous point and be like, oh, we don't know, maybe that'll be a good surprise.
And yeah, and the other sort of counter example, I wonder how you think about, you know, issues like toxic mushrooms, that is, organisms that develop toxic substances to kill predators who try to consume them, right? So, which is for me fascinating about actually plants that unlike animals who in case of conflict can at least try to escape, or they fight physically because they are more mobile. Plants, they had to become so sophisticated in the chemical fights and developing, you know, chemical artilleries to either defend themselves by toxic substances to other life forms, or to, on the other hand, attract other life forms, like, you know, pheromones. So, for example, in this sense, plants are much more sophisticated ways, you know, forms of life than the animal kingdom, right? But I think, of course, the toxic substance, the toxicity is always relational. It's in relation to, and definitely it's not produced as a waste from the perspective of the plant, because you know, why would you? Well, it's actively produced to defend yourself, but still it's a substance to destroy or detract at least other forms of life.
Yes, and I mean, in that sense, it is a bit like the violence of eating something or biting back something that tries to eat you and thereby somehow killing it. But I guess I do have a certain hidden, or not even hidden, I think in the new book it's pretty open, normative assumption that the greater biodiversity, the better. And that's kind of the beauty of the Holocene that we're just unfortunately losing, that this was, it still almost is, the most biodiverse ecology we had on the planet, and we had it for 11,000 years with many different niches. And I guess I have a certain value that's in itself, that diversity is in itself a good thing, and the toxicity you describe, it rather helps enhance that, whereas, yeah, DDT just helps make many species just go extinct and make very boring ecosystems where you then only have one type of mosquito or slug or something. And I mean, that's not, you can't then derive all sorts of other guidelines for action from that. But I think, like, all the things I've learned about ecology and the ecosystem studies in the last years have sort of stabilize that idea that a greater biodiversity is a sort of not just a beautiful, but also a good thing. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I share your anthropocentric position, because it's the kind of biodiversity we are able to appreciate with our senses. But as you mentioned yourself earlier, you know, most of the life is in the microbial form.
Yeah.
So, you know, most of the biodiversity is in this realm anyway, which I think is much more resilient to anything we are trying to mess up here in this.
I'll use that next time when somebody asks me, how do you keep hope? And I hate that question, I'm going to say.
This is actually a super optimistic thesis. More questions, please.
I have a question, since you were just starting to talk about having hope, and I'm just going to destroy that again. Something that I don't really understand is why, so there are those different aspects of what property is, and it's something you're allowed to destroy and discard, and what I don't get is why does it seem that the right to destroy and discard is so dominant? Because I often think about the fact that when you get climate protesters who are, for example, blocking the road so cars can't drive there, and then the people driving the cars get really furious about their right to drive cars. And I imagine the car drivers as people who, let's say, they are more conservative, they are into the idea of family, they have children. Why do they not have the idea of property as something that you would be able to pass on, like that their children will be able to breathe in the future? And why doesn't the idea that you want your children to be able to breathe trump the wish to drive your car everywhere in your country? Like, I am confused by how strong the anger is of the car driver.
So, yeah, it's fascinating, and I think one lead maybe is the air isn't propertized yet, mostly. So it's and our notion of freedom and also of entitlement to a resource is derived from a property logic, where, you know, it's very hard to detect a violation of freedom if it's not a violation of property right. And my grandchild or youngest lover doesn't have a right, they don't own their parcel of air. You just hope that there will still be air in common that is breathable. And so somehow the destruction of that is not registered in the same intensity as the ban on a certain SUV car or something, which is already property. I mean, that's what I think is fundamentally rotten also with our notion of property, but freedom. And I think another thing is, of course, that there is an intense pressure in a competitive society to just get the next steps done. And then, like, there's probably a real felt urgency to get wherever you have to get with a car that is just more salient than whatever happens in the future. And I also think, like, the way that we are trained just to function in normal life to blank out need and suffering around us, like, you know, in the same cities where people are protesting against whatever climate injustice and some flood now in the south of Brazil, there are people dying on the street, and somehow that's just happening, you know. So that there is you need somehow always an additional reason to really feel that something affects you. And I am, in this case, not even I think this whole logic with trying to convince people by appealing to the sense of responsibility for their grandchildren, it's just not gonna fly, because everything that we fear that might happen to our grandchildren in the future is already happening to somebody now. And if I only care about it if it's my grandchild, then probably I'm better off sort of fencing in and shoring up the, or at least I think in the end that won't even be true, but it seems you're better off just, you know, having a segregated world with a fortress Europe where your grandchild's inheritance is saved against, well, like in Brown Life. So yeah, I think that's as good as I can attempt to answer that.
Okay.
My methodological note on this is that I truly believe that there is too little research, empirical research, and I mean ethnographic research, qualitative sociological research on those normal people, you know, whatever, even not, you know, reactionary fascist movements, sort of. While there is quite some research and also philosophical reflection, as you know, you richly provide on those progressives, and for, you know, probably understandable reasons, because it's always much more comfortable to do research on with somebody you are more prone to sympathize with or recognize or relate to. But I think that actually to really understand and being able to address such questions that you pose, it would have been important that, you know, leftist scholars, political ecologists, whatever, do more studies on the other side, and do it in a way that does not presuppose, you know, evil intention necessarily, or evil thinking, or misplaced ideology, but really try to approach those people, groups, with recognition and honestly face, you know, how they articulate their concerns, situations, you know, along the lines, for example, this, I forget her name, but there has been, there is a really interesting sociological book published a few years ago on basically Trumpist voters.
Ali Horschel?
Yeah. Ali Horschel. You know, which was done with those right-wing conservative people in the US.
So I think from the theoretical niche which I inhabit, which of course is not very, like, it doesn't cover a lot of ground in the academy, but from that tradition it's really the opposite. So I mean, the Frankfurt School has always done ideology critique, and like the grand studies of the authoritarian personality were all kind of directed at in some sense the majority groups. And there is some continuation of that. So for instance, Oliver Nachtwey has just, well anyway, I don't need it, like lots of German books. It's also one study that keeps being made every 3 years, I think, the Leipziger Mitte-Studie, and then there's a Bertelsmann-Studie that Lucy translates. So I think there is some of that research, but I agree with you that it is a very tricky thing how to do it without a kind of stereotyping presupposition. Though, of course, I mean, sociologists or ethnographers also are trained to all the time think about that. And then from a Frankfurt School perspective, we would think that you can't just, like, the problem is anyway not with the individual. So they aren't any more good or evil intentioned. The question always is, what kind of society creates the condition for that sort of being a rational way to view things? Like how is it that becomes just sort of self-evident? And there I think Adi Hochschild in a way lacks the last interesting move, where so her book is entitled Strangers in Their Own Land, and she keeps like retelling those stories of people who are like, I don't know my country anymore. But then they somehow blame it on the immigrants and not on the capitalism that has indeed taken over. I mean, something has taken over their land. And maybe it's not just capitalism, maybe it's something else, but the fact that their living areas have changed, or life worlds have changed drastically in the last decades without them having any control over that change. That is true. So in a way that this Adorno says there's always, ideologies are always true and false at the same time. And I think that's what we kind of need to work out and then condemn the conditions that make them seem true, not the people. I mean, also what's it going to do? Soon they're the majority, then we can condemn all we want to anyway, kind of not just endangering ourselves. And so I think also the time where one has to be very humble and self-critical to not look down on those poor deplorables anyway over, because they're kind of on the ascent to rule us.
Thank you. I think we are slowly heading the
we're getting some time.
End of our public part of the debate. We probably stay here somewhere, and there are also the books to buy, and I guess Eva stays with us here, but anyway, now if you want to pose a question or comment something in this sort of environment, just do it now. If not, I wanted also to ask Tereza, because there was a second provocative question, and yeah, so that we just...
And this is the one I'm really curious about.
So now it's time for you.
From the beginning, I got the translation of your book. How do you feel about your face being on the cover of the book?
I checked it on the publisher's website and saw that that's the aesthetic for the series. So my vanity of hoping it was just because of my extraordinary beauty was destroyed. And then I thought, okay, it's not so embarrassing, it's just generally what they do with that series, and so I don't mess with it. I thought it was the most modest way to go to not make a fuss.
I mean, and I would probably do the same if they ever decided to publish some manuscript of mine in the series.
I
was also, you know, sort of struck by the contradiction of, you know, some of the ideas in the book, and this, you know, this is the author, you know, and this is the face. And I must say that for example, each time, which is not that often, but each time I am giving some interview to, you know, whatever judge, public media, they would care so much about getting the photos. And it can be, however, intellectual journal, but they still insist so much that they would take photographs of yourself and then sort of I always try to resist it while knowing I won't be successful, but I am at least trying to resist to sort of highlight the non-obviousness of this requirement or expectation that ideas have to be packaged with the face.
So when you read an article about or an interview with someone, don't you secretly also want to see their photo? Like there's an interview with Judith Butler, do you really not care about their photo?
That's a good point. and the question is, why do we in fact feel this desire, need, whatever? Why?
Well, I think it is a bit about the animals we are, right? And I mean, for me, I think I just am a bit of an exhibitionist, so it's a not so hard price to pay, and I feel the type of prostitution that I had to do in some other areas of life to earn a living were sort of more painful to me. But I do think that there is a centrism of very quick images in our media communication generally at the moment that destroy the capacity to think and imagine and tell stories and narratives. But I feel as long as the quite long book with a lot of stories in there gets printed as well, then it's an okay balance.
Okay, that's. I thought now we finish with the critique of the publishing house, but it was sort of smooth. Actually, it's a good price, and it's just great that this book is now in Czech, and we can a lot of people can read it more easily than in German in this country. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you especially to Tereza and to Eva for today. And those of you who still want to discuss more, just stay here, or even you can join us tomorrow at the výstaviště Svět knihy, where I think at 3 o'clock, yes, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we will have another debate with
another
Eva.
Tereza.
And another Tereza Matějčková, and I am, because it's another partner in the discussion, I am quite sure that the debate will be different. So so it's an invitation also to those who are now here, because I think we will probably discuss slightly other topics, and probably in a different way. So just join us as well.
And it will be in German, right?
And no, but it will be. We will speak in German on the stage, but it will be translated to Czech, so we can listen in Czech and also speak in pose questions in Czech, and somebody will translate it for Eva to German. So just. That's not a limitation. Yes. So thank you once more. Kdo máte zájem knížku, tak si ji tady můžete koupit.